Democrats, stop being so negative. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So I must admit I was entertained by this cartoon in the Washington Post today that seemed to indicate that Democrats are freaking out over President Biden running for re-election. Granted, he's got some problems. He is old, although frankly, I hope I'm as vital as he is at his age. He's certainly got a lot more energy and seems a lot healthier than Donald Trump, to be sure. And he's not the most exciting guy ever, which is kind of surprising given the fact that this is the guy who back in 1988 plagiarized British Labour leader Neil Kinnock. Back then they talked about what an exciting speaker Joe Biden was, but I guess to deliver on that excitement, he needed to plagiarize other people. I like it much better the way he's doing it now. Truth be told, he provides an excellent contrast to Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and the other Republican crazies. I mean, he promised to deliver government without drama and a government that could work for average people. And guess what? He's actually largely delivered on that. True, his poll numbers have never really recovered since the Afghan withdrawal, which, to be fair, looked really bad. No doubt about that. But ironically, Biden told his aides that he did not want that to happen, that he wanted to make sure that the planning was done to ensure that there was no such crisis. The way he described it is like the pictures of the helicopters on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam. He wanted to avoid that. Unfortunately, the reality is that no amount of planning was going to prop up that government. There was nothing we could do in Afghanistan. And the choice was not one of stay or withdraw in a more orderly fashion or withdraw the way that the withdrawal actually occurred. The choice was one of stay and try to prop up this failure of a government ad infinitum, or withdraw and watch the country dissolve into chaos. Sad to say, but the second choice was the better one. And we have to remember that President Biden did manage to evacuate over 120,000 of our allies in the process of our withdrawal. But let's face it, Afghanistan was going to be a mess no matter when it happened, no matter how it happened. And you've at least got to give President Biden credit for the fact that he got us out of there, after multiple other presidents had promised to, but never did. But that's just the beginning of his foreign policy accomplishments. I mean, even Mitch McConnell has praised the kind of leadership that he has delivered as a result of the Ukraine invasion. Who would have predicted, after 4 years of Donald Trump, that NATO would be stronger than it ever was, and that we'd be adding members, including Finland and Sweden, who had been neutral for 40 years and had pledged to remain neutral. And for all the talk about division at the recent NATO summit, the only debate seems to be how quickly we're able to admit Ukraine into the organization. Truth be told, though, most people don't focus on foreign policy when they're electing their president, which is ironic because that's actually the area where the president can have the greatest impact. But within that context, his economic record is actually enviable. Unemployment is down to a 56-year low, and inflation has been slowing steadily to the point that now, for several months, most Americans have actually seen their real pay increase. That's the amount of income they get after you take into account inflation. And the data indicate that Americans more and more believe that inflation is coming down and under control. And who would have predicted that he would have turned the narrowest of majorities that he had in both the Senate and the House into one of the most impressive legislative records of any modern president? I mean, let's start with the infrastructure bill, which actually, if you drive around, you can see signs detailing projects that are being funded by the infrastructure bill. It's to the point that Republicans, including Tommy Tuberville, for example, are running around touting the federal funds coming in to assist their districts, despite the fact that they voted against the legislation. And for how long did we have to endure the infrastructure week after infrastructure week after infrastructure week during the Trump presidency, only to have Joe Biden actually deliver on it? And how could we forget the Inflation Reduction Act? Probably the most misnamed piece of legislation in history. But that being said, an outstanding piece of legislation. Probably the most important piece of environmental legislation since, well, I don't know when, since maybe the Clean Air Act. And who would have predicted that the United States would actually be on track to meet the climate goals that were set in the Paris Accord? But we are, thanks to that legislation. And that discussion even forgets the part of the legislation that dealt with healthcare costs. I mean, the biggest complaint that there is against the Inflation Reduction Act is it's been so successful that it's actually costing more than was expected. Businesses are taking advantage of the incentives that were out there to make investments in their clean manufacturing. And that, combined with the CHIPS Semiconductor Act, have resulted in a historic increase in manufacturing in the United States. Despite all of Trump's rhetoric about bringing back manufacturing, it's Joe Biden who's done it. And that's not to mention the first gun safety law in almost 30 years. Granted, a modest one, but still a gun safety law nonetheless. A bill codifying same-sex marriage, one aiding veterans who were exposed to toxic burn pits, and an electoral reform bill aimed at addressing some of the weaknesses that Trump found in our system. And then you've got Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman ever to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. All in all, this is a very impressive record. It's not surprising that the same historians who rank Donald Trump as one of the worst presidents in history rank Joe Biden as being right there along with Ronald Reagan, praising his integrity and his ability to compromise in particular. I saw today a news release on CNN detailing how President Biden, with his aides behind closed doors, sometimes loses his temper. And they said that's quite a contrast with his public image of being Uncle Joe. But gosh darn it, he's obviously a guy who can get things done. And frankly, it's nice to have a Democrat in the White House who can get things done. I mean, many of these lists that rank president, frankly, were compiled prior to President Biden's effective maneuvering around the debt ceiling, which I think in the future is going to go down as a textbook case in how to deal with this kind of crisis. So with this kind of record, Democrats, for crying out loud, stop being so negative. President Biden is out there talking about Bidenomics and pointing out all the positive things we have to say about it, and we should be doing the same thing. I mean, Biden's not perfect. He'd be the first person to tell you that. But among the available choices, he's a pretty darn good one. Well, if you want to see another video where I detail how President Biden's economic record is so much stronger than President Trump's, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.